Our daughter is a thief, and we have proof. That was the sentence that hung in the air, sharp and suffocating, like the smell of burnt turkey. It's what my father said, standing at the head of the Thanksgiving table, framed by the autumn afternoon light pouring through Aunt Marlene's lace curtains. In front of 30 relatives, their faces frozen in mid-chew, their glasses of sweet tea suspended halfway to their lips, he held a white envelope like it was a verdict he'd been rehearsing for weeks. He didn't look at me with love. He looked at me with the cold, calculated stare of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. He slid the envelope across the table, the paper whispering against the tablecloth, stopping right at the edge of my plate. A court summons. Every eye in that dining room, 30 pairs of them, locked onto my face, waiting for the crack, the flinch, the breakdown. My mother was already crying, her favorite weapon loaded and ready, tears streaming down her face in a performance so practiced it could have won an Oscar. I looked at the envelope. Then I looked at my father, and I smiled. It wasn't a smile of happiness. It was a smile of absolute certainty. Because 4 months earlier, sick of the whispers and the lies, I'd hired someone whose entire job is tracing where money disappears to die. And what they found didn't just clear my name. It blew apart a lie. My parents had been building since the day my grandfather, Earl Palmer, drew his last breath. Let's see how far this story travels. My name is Oilia. I'm 32 years old, a registered nurse from a small town in Georgia, and this is the story of how I lost my inheritance, my credit score, and almost my reputation, and how I got them all back in one unforgettable afternoon. Now, let me take you back 8 months, to the week my grandfather, Earl Palmer, was buried. My grandfather, Earl James Palmer, died on a Tuesday in March. He was 84. The official cause was pneumonia, a ruthless, fluid-filled end that the doctors said was quick, though in my experience, nothing about death is ever truly quick for the ones left behind. I drove 3 hours from my cramped apartment in the city to the funeral home in Dawson, Georgia. Dawson is the kind of town with a population that hovers around 4,000, give or take a few transient souls. It's the kind of place where the magnolia trees drop their leaves into gutters that haven't been cleaned in a decade, and where everyone knows your maiden name, your parents' credit score, and exactly who you sat next to at the homecoming game 10 years ago. I grew up there, in the red clay and the humidity. My grandfather raised me half the time while my parents were busy with their own chaos. He was the one who taught me to read, sitting on his porch with a faded picture book while the cicadas screamed in the background. He took me fishing every summer at Lake Blackshear until I was 15 and thought I was too cool for a tackle box and a grandfather who wore suspenders. When I got accepted into nursing school, a massive achievement for a girl whose family tree was full of blue-collar branches, he mailed me a card with a $50 check inside. On the memo line in his shaky, distinctive script, he wrote, "Proud of you, Ophi." It was the kind of validation I craved, the kind that felt like a warm blanket. But the last 3 years of his life, that warmth vanished. I barely heard from him. I called, leaving voicemails that were never returned. I sent letters, birthday cards, photos from work, a Christmas note every December filled with updates about my life. Nothing came back. No reply, no returned mail either. Just silence. I told myself he was getting older, maybe confused, succumbing to the fog of age, or maybe he was angry about something I couldn't remember doing. I made excuses for the silence because the truth was too heavy to carry. At the funeral, my father, Gerald, stood at the front of the chapel, commanding the room. He delivered a eulogy that could have won an award. Tears glistened in his eyes, his voice cracking at the precise moments that maximized emotional impact. "My father was the greatest man I ever knew," he said, gripping the podium with white-knuckled intensity. I sat in the 3rd row, alone. Nobody asked me to sit closer to the family pew. After the service, while the smell of lilies still clung to the air, Gerald gathered us in the church hallway. Me, my brother Nolan, a few cousins who had traveled in for the service. He straightened his tie, a nervous habit he'd perfected, and said, "Dad left everything to me. The house, the savings, all of it. That was his final wish." He said it with such finality, such smooth confidence that no one questioned him. The relatives nodded, murmuring their acceptance. I almost didn't question it either. But something about the way he said it, too smooth, too rehearsed, sat wrong in my chest, like a number on a chart that doesn't match the patient's symptoms. It felt like a diagnosis that had been written before the tests were even run. Let me back up 10 years, to where the cracks in the foundation really started to show. I was 22, fresh out of nursing school, working my first job at the county hospital. I was pulling 12-hour shifts, my feet aching, my student loans already breathing down my neck like a predator. I was sharing a 2-bedroom apartment with another nurse to save money, eating frozen burritos 3 nights a week because they were cheap and filling. It was a Sunday evening when my father called me. His voice was tight, controlled. He said he needed me to come to the house. When I got there, the atmosphere was heavy. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers in front of him. My mother, Denise, sat beside him, her eyes already red and puffy, a tissue clutched in her hand. "We need your help, sweetheart," Gerald said, his voice soft, the voice he used when he wanted something. "Just your signature. The bank needs a co-signer for the mortgage. It's temporary. 6 months, maybe less. Then I refinance, and your name comes off." Denise dabbed her eyes and let out a small sob. "We could lose the house, Oilia, please." I looked at them. My father, the man who had provided for us, and my mother, the emotional center of our family. I was young, naive, desperate to help, desperate to be the good daughter, so I signed. I didn't read the fine print. I didn't consult a lawyer. I just signed my name on the dotted line, effectively tying my financial future to theirs. 6 months turned into a year. A year turned into 5. 5 became 10. Every time I brought it up, the conversation went the same way. "Dad, when are you refinancing?" I ask. "My credit's not there yet," he'd say, avoiding my eyes. "You want us on the street? Is that what you want?" And my mother would cry every single time, like clockwork, her tears acting as a silencer for my legitimate concerns. I learned to stop asking. I learned to swallow my frustration. Here is what that signature cost me. It cost me my autonomy. I couldn't qualify for my own mortgage because my debt-to-income ratio was skewed by their house. I couldn't get approved for a car loan without a brutal interest rate because my credit score was being held hostage. My score bounced between 580 and 620 because Gerald was late on payments, sometimes 30 days, sometimes 60, and he never once told me. I found out by accident from a credit monitoring alert that pinged my phone at 2 in the morning. 2 60-day lates I never knew about. My score had dropped 40 points overnight. I called him the next day, my hands shaking with rage. He brushed me off. "Things were tight," he said. "I handled it." He handled it with my name. He handled it by sacrificing my financial health for his comfort. 2 weeks after the funeral, I sat Gerald down at his kitchen table, the same table where I had signed away my financial freedom a decade earlier. I was 32 now, hardened by years of shift work and the realization that my parents did not have my best interests at heart. I said it plainly, no anger, just facts. "Dad, I need my name off that mortgage this year." No tears, no yelling, just a boundary. Gerald leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "Now is not the time, Olia. I just buried my father." "I know, and I'm sorry," I replied, holding my ground. "But this has been 10 years. His jaw tightened. I could see the muscle pulsing under his skin. "You want me to refinance right now? With what credit? You think banks are lining up for a 61-year-old retired insurance man?" "Then sell the house," I said. "Downsize, I don't care how, but I need off that loan." He stood up so fast the chair scraped violently against the linoleum floor. "You want to talk about lawyers? You want to sue your own parents? Go ahead, see how that looks." I hadn't said anything about lawyers. He added that himself. That was the first tell. Guilty people jump to defenses before accusations are even made. That night, the phone lines in the family started burning. My mother made 8 phone calls. I know this because 4 different relatives called me within 3 days, their voices dripping with judgment. Aunt Marlene texted me a wall of text. "Your parents raised you and this is how you repay them. Shame on you, Oilia." My cousin Megan left a voicemail that sounded like a threat. "Hey, I heard you're threatening to take your parents' house. What's going on?" My father's cousin Danny called and said, "Family doesn't do this to family." Every single one of them had the same version of the story. The version Gerald and Denise had fed them. Oilia is ungrateful. Oilia wants to take the house. Oilia is turning on her own parents right after they lost Earl. Nobody called to ask my side. They didn't want the truth. They wanted the drama. Then Gerald called me one last time. His voice was flat, cold, devoid of the paternal warmth he used to manipulate me. "You think you're the only one who can play this game? Your grandfather left everything to me. And if you keep pushing, everyone's going to know what you really did with his money." I froze. I had no idea what he meant. I hadn't touched a dime, but he was already building the story. He was planting the seeds of a lie that he hoped would choke out the truth. I sat in my car outside the hospital after a grueling 12-hour night shift. I was exhausted, smelling of antiseptic and sweat, and I did the math on the back of a crumpled pharmacy receipt. If Gerald stopped paying the mortgage entirely, which he'd threatened to do during arguments in the past, the bank would come after both of us. Foreclosure. My credit wouldn't just drop, it would crater below 500 for years. Some hospitals run credit checks on employees. Not all, but some. Mine did. A foreclosure on my record could flag a review. I could lose my job, the only stable thing I had. If I took over the payments myself to protect my credit, it was $1,800 a month on a nurse's salary in rural Georgia. I'd be broke inside of 18 months. I was already paying rent, student loans, car insurance, groceries. There was no margin for error. I was trapped. Then, in a moment of desperate clarity, I pulled up the mortgage account online. I still had login access from years ago when Gerald had asked me to keep an eye on things for him. That's when I saw it. A new line item. A home equity withdrawal. $40,000, taken out 3 months before Grandpa Earl died. Gerald hadn't just kept my name on the mortgage. He'd used my co-signature, my trust, to borrow more money against the house without telling me, without my consent. $40,000 I never saw, never approved, now tied to my name like an anchor. I sat there for a long time, the engine of my car cooling in the quiet parking lot. The receipt was full of numbers that didn't add up, much like my life. He didn't just trap me. He went back to the trap and made it deeper. The rumors didn't start with a bang. They started with whispers, quiet conversations that stopped when I walked into a room. Gerald and Denise began telling family, casually, like it was common knowledge they were saddened to share, that I had taken cash from Grandpa Earl's house before he died. She went over there alone a few times near the end, Gerald told people, his voice heavy with disappointment. We found the dresser drawer empty afterward, thousands of dollars gone. There was no proof. There didn't need to be. In a town like Dawson, a father's word carries the weight of gospel. My cousin Travis called me one evening, sounding awkward. Hey, Uncle Gerald said you took some money from Grandpa's dresser. A few thousand, what's that about? That never happened, Travis, I said, my voice firm but tired. Okay, I'm just telling you what he said. That was the pattern. Nobody accused me directly. They just passed along what they heard. And every time I denied it, I sounded more defensive, which made me sound more guilty in their eyes. At church the following Sunday, First Baptist, where my family had attended for 30 years, a woman named Mrs. Gentry looked right at me in the fellowship hall. For a second, I thought she was going to say hello. Instead, she turned her back and walked to the other side of the room. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. At work, the toxicity began to bleed into my professional life. A nurse on my unit pulled me aside during a break. Everything okay at home? I heard something from my neighbor about your family and some legal stuff. Just be careful. It was leaking. My father's lies were contaminating the one space where I had built a reputation of competence and care. That's when it clicked. Gerald wasn't just covering his tracks. He was building a narrative. If anyone ever questioned the inheritance or the mortgage, he wanted the whole town already primed to believe one thing: Oilia is the thief. But he slipped. He mentioned the dresser drawer. Specific details often betray the liar. How did he know Grandpa kept cash in a dresser drawer unless he'd been in that drawer himself? I drove 45 minutes to the county courthouse on my day off. I parked in the back lot, my heart hammering against my ribs. I walked in wearing scrubs I hadn't changed out of because I'd come straight from a shift. The clerk at the probate office was a woman named Deanne, with reading glasses perched on the end of her nose on a beaded chain. I told her I needed a copy of the probate file for Earl James Palmer, deceased March of this year. Relation? She asked, peering over her glasses. Granddaughter, I said. She didn't hesitate. Probate records are public, anyone can request them. She printed the file and handed it to me in a manila folder. I sat on a bench in the quiet, dusty hallway of the courthouse and opened it. The will was there. It was the one Gerald had filed. Typed, notarized, dated 14 months before Grandpa died. It said, I leave all real and personal property to my son, Gerald Ray Palmer. All of it. The house, the savings accounts, everything. I read it twice, my throat tightening. Then I looked at the signature at the bottom. Earl James Palmer. I'd seen my grandfather's handwriting hundreds of times, on birthday cards every year, on the memo line of every Christmas check. On a note he left in my lunchbox once when I was 9 that said, "You're smarter than you think, oi." His handwriting was shaky, a tremor from age but specific. The E always leaned left like it was bowing to the wind. The P had a long tail that swept below the line. It was as familiar to me as the back of my own hand. Signature on that will was close. It was a good attempt, but it wasn't his. The E was too upright. The P was too short, truncated. The whole thing was too careful, too clean. It looked like someone trying very hard to copy something they had only seen a few times, lacking the natural flow of muscle memory. I took a photo of the signature with my phone. My hands were steady. I wasn't sad anymore. I was certain. I opened my phone and typed into the search bar, "Forensic accountant near me." A call came on a Wednesday night. I was eating leftover soup at my kitchen counter, staring at the wall when Gerald's name lit up my screen. I almost didn't answer, but I knew avoiding him would only fuel his narrative. "Thanksgiving at Marlene's," he said without a hello. "You're coming." "I'll think about it," I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral. "No, you will be there and you'll apologize," he snapped. I set my spoon down, the metal clinking loudly against the ceramic bowl. "Apologize for what?" "What you stole in front of everyone." "I didn't steal anything, Dad." "Then you won't mind proving it." A pause, heavy with malice. "See you Thursday." He hung up before I could respond. I stood in my kitchen for a long time, holding the phone against my thigh. The soup got cold. I didn't touch it again. Gerald wasn't inviting me to dinner. He was building a courtroom. 20 minutes later, my mother texted. The message was long, 4 paragraphs of her usual flowery, manipulative language. Words like healing and closure and as a family. The last line read, "Your father just wants to resolve this privately. Don't make it bigger than it needs to be." Privately in front of 30 people. I learned later that Gerald had called 10 additional relatives, people who normally skipped Thanksgiving, to ensure the room was full. He wanted witnesses. Not witnesses to the truth, but witnesses to the performance. I sat on my couch that night and stared at the ceiling. I had a choice. I could skip Thanksgiving, stay home, let Gerald tell whatever story he wanted to an audience that already believed him. Or I could walk into that room and face whatever he'd prepared. I thought about my grandfather, about 3 years of silence that wasn't silence at all, but sabotage. I texted Gerald back one word, "Coming." Denise called Nolan the next day. I know because Nolan called me an hour later, sounding like a man standing on a bridge trying to figure out which side to jump to. "What's going on, Olia? Mom says you took money from Grandpa." "Did you ever see me take anything, Nolan?" I asked, my voice steady, a beat of silence. "No. Did I ever mention Grandpa's money to you? Ever?" "No, but Mom's really upset." "Mom's upset because I asked Dad to refinance the mortgage," I said, laying it out. "That's all this is." He went quiet. Nolan was 28, an electrician, lived 12 minutes from our parents. He'd watched me carry that mortgage for a decade without complaining. He knew what it cost me. He just never said anything about it because in our family, you didn't question Gerald. You absorbed it and moved on. "They want me to stand with them at Thanksgiving," he said, his voice low. "Mom said the family needs to be united." "United against who, me?" He didn't answer that. "I'm not asking you to pick a side, Nolan. Just keep your eyes open." More silence, then quietly, "I'll be there, but I'm not giving any speeches." I told him that was enough. We hung up, but something stuck with me. The pause before he said no when I asked if he'd seen me take anything. It wasn't the pause of someone uncertain about the answer. It was the pause of someone who wanted to say something else entirely, something heavier, and swallowed it instead. I didn't push. I figured if Nolan had something to tell me, he'd find the moment. I just didn't know the moment was already 2 months old, sitting in his phone, recorded in a kitchen he was never supposed to be in. Linda Marsh had an office above a hardware store in Cordelli, 20 minutes south of Dawson. She was a forensic accountant with 15 years of experience tracing money through estates, divorces, and small business fraud. I found her through a Google search at 2 in the morning and booked the appointment before I could talk myself out of it. She was calm, gray hair, reading glasses, a desk covered in folders. She didn't react emotionally when I told her the story. She just took notes, her pen scratching against the paper in a rhythmic, comforting way. 4 months later, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, I was back in her office. She placed a bound report on the desk between us. It was heavy, substantial. "The signature on the filed will doesn't match," she said, her voice professional and detached. "I compared it to 17 other verified documents, tax returns, bank cards, a vehicle title from 2014. It's not his hand." "You're sure?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I'm sure. She flipped to the financial section. Earl's savings account held $280,000 at the time of his death. The house appraised at roughly $190,000. Total estate value approximately $470,000. She paused. After probate closed, Gerald withdrew $350,000 across several transactions. Linda had mapped every dollar. It was a trail of greed. $120,000 paid off Gerald's personal credit card debt. $85,000 went to an outstanding truck loan. $60,000 was transferred to an account under Denise's name. $45,000 paid a contractor for home renovations. $40,000 was pulled in cash, untraceable. I stared at the numbers. The room felt cold. He forged the will, I said, stating the fact aloud for the first time, and took $350,000. Linda nodded. Do you want me to compile this into a formal report? Because once I do, this becomes something you can't walk back. I didn't hesitate. Do it. She closed the folder. I'll have it ready in 10 days. 10 days? That would be 3 days before Thanksgiving. $350,000, that wasn't desperation. That was a plan. That was a heist. My grandfather used to mention his sister Ruth now, and then, usually in passing. Ruth's got more sense than the rest of us combined, he'd say, shaking his head like it was both a compliment and a complaint. Ruth Palmer, 74, lived alone in a cluttered house in Americus, 40 minutes south. She hadn't come to a family dinner in 9 years due to some falling out with Gerald that no one explained and everyone accepted. I found her number in Grandpa's old address book, which I'd kept in a shoebox after the funeral. I called on a Thursday evening, half expecting the line to be disconnected. She picked up on the second ring. Mrs. Palmer, this is Oilia, Earl's granddaughter. Silence long enough that I thought I'd lost the connection. Then softly, Earl told me you'd call one day. The air left my lungs. What do you mean? Your grandpa gave me something, 3 years ago, told me to keep it safe. Said if anything went wrong after he passed, you'd come looking. She invited me to her house that Saturday. I drove down with my heart beating so hard I could feel it in my fingers. Ruth met me at the door. She didn't hug me. She just looked at me for a long moment, her eyes sharp and assessing, then handed me a yellowed envelope. Inside was a handwritten will, Earl's real handwriting. Shaky, leaning, unmistakable. Witnessed by 2 neighbors, dated 5 years before his death. The contents were simple. Everything divided equally among 4 grandchildren, Oilia, Nolan, Travis, and Megan. Not Gerald, not his son, his grandchildren. I looked up at Ruth. She sat down heavily in an armchair. Gerald came to your grandpa's house every week those last 3 years, she said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. Told Earl you didn't want to see him anymore, said you'd moved on. The world tilted on its axis. My grandfather didn't stop calling me. Gerald stopped him. He isolated him, fed him lies, and stole his legacy. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, at 10:14 p.m., Nolan's name lit up my screen. I need to tell you something, he said. His voice was low, rushed, like a man talking in a room he wasn't supposed to be in. Don't ask how I know. Okay. 2 months ago, I went to the house to grab my drill set from the garage. I came through the side door. Mom and Dad were in the kitchen. They didn't hear me come in. He paused. I could hear him breathing, shallow and fast. Dad was saying, I'm going to tell you exactly what he said. She can't prove anything. The will is filed. It's done. I gripped the edge of the couch cushion, my knuckles white. And then Mom said, but what if she gets a lawyer? And Dad said, then we go louder. We make her the villain. Nobody's going to believe her over us. Silence on both ends. Nolan, tell me you recorded that. I hit record the second I heard them arguing. I have the whole thing. He sent me the audio file while we were still on the phone. I played it. Gerald's voice filled my apartment. Muffled, tiny, but unmistakable. Denise's, too. Every word exactly as Nolan described. It was the smoking gun. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked. He was quiet for a long time. Then because I was scared, Oilia. They're my parents, too. I didn't know what to do with it. I understood that. I really did. Fear doesn't always look like shaking hands. Sometimes it looks like 2 months of silence, carrying a recording on your phone like a grenade you don't know how to throw. Thank you, I said. That took guts. What are you going to do? I don't know yet, I replied, but I'm not going to Thanksgiving empty-handed. The estate attorney's name was Harlan Bates. He had a small office on Main Street in Albany, wood-paneled walls, a University of Georgia diploma, and a handshake that meant something. I laid everything on his desk. Linda Marsh's forensic report, the handwritten will from Aunt Ruth, the probate file from the courthouse, and the audio recording from Nolan. He spent 40 minutes reading. Didn't say a word until he was finished. Then he looked up, his eyes grave. This is fraud, clear as day. Forged signature, falsified probate filing, misappropriation of estate assets. You have standing to challenge the will and file a civil claim. If the DA's office picks it up, it could go criminal. I'm not suing anyone, not yet, I said. I just need to be ready. He nodded slowly. Ready for what exactly? My father is planning something for Thanksgiving. I don't know what, but I know him. He won't let this go quietly. Heron assembled a packet for me. A summary of the forensic findings, a certified copy of the original will, and a printout of the account transfers showing where the $350,000 went. He put it all in a large manila envelope and sealed it. If you ever need to use this, he said, it speaks for itself. I put the envelope in my bag. That evening, I called Aunt Ruth. Would you come to Thanksgiving at Marlene's? Silence. Then I haven't been to a family dinner in 9 years. I know. Another pause. For Earl, I'll be there. I hung up and sat on the edge of my bed. The envelope was in my bag by the door. If Gerald said nothing at Thanksgiving, it would stay there, sealed, untouched. But I knew my father. Silence had never been his style. Thanksgiving morning. Aunt Marlene's house sat on a half-acre lot on Pinewood Drive, a white ranch style with black shutters and an American flag on the porch. The driveway was already full when I pulled up at 1:15. Trucks, sedans, a minivan with a car seat in the back. Someone had taped paper turkeys to the front door. Inside, 3 long tables were pushed together down the center of the living room, covered in mismatched tablecloths. 32 place settings. The smell of roasted turkey and cornbread dressing hit me before I cleared the doorway, thick and cloying. I stepped in and the room shifted. Not loudly, not obviously, but I felt it. A half-second pause in conversation, a few heads turning. Someone near the kitchen glanced at me and looked away fast. Everyone here had heard the rumors. Everyone had already picked a side. Aunt Marlene hugged me at the door. Good to see you, honey. But her arms were stiff, and she let go a beat too soon. Gerald sat at the head of the center table. He was wearing a navy blazer and a pressed shirt, dressed up, which was unusual for Thanksgiving. Denise was beside him in a cream-colored sweater, hands folded, eyes already glistening. They looked like a couple posing for a church directory photo. Gerald saw me and smiled, not a smile of warmth but of satisfaction, the smile of a man who's already rehearsed the next 2 hours. Aunt Ruth arrived 15 minutes later. She came through the side door quietly and sat at the far end of the table. Nobody greeted her. Most of the younger cousins didn't even recognize her. 9 years is a long time. Nolan was in the middle of the table, staring at his empty plate like it held the answers to the universe. I set my bag under my chair. The envelope pressed against my ankle, cold and heavy. The turkey was carved. The prayer was said. And Gerald waited. We were 20 minutes into the meal when Gerald tapped his knife against his water glass. The sound cut through the chatter, sharp and demanding. The room went quiet in layers. The adults first, then the teenagers, then the kids at the folding table near the window. Someone turned down the football game on the TV in the den. Gerald stood. He placed both hands on the table, leaned forward slightly, and looked around the room like a man about to deliver a sermon. Before we go around and say what we're thankful for, he began, his voice booming, I need to address something that's been weighing on this family. My pulse climbed, but I didn't move. I kept my hands in my lap, breathing slowly. He looked at Denise. She dabbed her eyes with a napkin right on cue. Most of you have heard the rumors, Gerald continued. I wish I didn't have to do this publicly. Believe me, Denise and I tried to handle it privately, but our daughter left us no choice. He paused for effect. A few relatives shifted in their seats. Uncle Danny set down his fork. After my father passed, we discovered that a significant amount of money was missing from his accounts. We looked into it, we traced it, and the evidence points to one person in this room. He turned to me. 32 faces followed his gaze like a flock of birds turning in the sky. Our daughter Oilia is a thief. His voice didn't waver. And we have proof. The room held its breath. Aunt Marlene's hand went to her mouth. Cousin Megan stared at me, wide-eyed. A great aunt I barely knew whispered to the woman beside her, "Oh my God!" Denise's crying grew louder, perfectly timed, perfectly pitched. Gerald stood over me like a judge at sentencing, and the entire room waited for me to crumble. I didn't. I folded my hands on the table and looked him in the eye. Gerald reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and pulled out a white envelope, crisp, official-looking. He walked slowly around the table, past Uncle Danny, past Cousin Travis, past Aunt Marlene, until he stood right beside my chair. He set the envelope in front of me. "This is a court summons," he said loud enough for every person in the room. "We are suing you for the return of my father's money." I picked it up. The room was so quiet I could hear the kids whispering at the folding table. I opened the flap and pulled out the document inside. It looked real at first glance. A header with the county court's name, a date, a defendant line with my full legal name, a signature at the bottom from someone I'd never heard of. But I'd spent 4 months sitting across from a lawyer. I knew what a real summons looked like. This one had no case number, no clerk's stamp. The font was wrong, too clean, too uniform. It was printed on regular copy paper, not filed stock. It was fake. Gerald had someone mock this up to scare me in front of 32 witnesses. I looked at the document, then I set it down gently next to my plate. Uncle Danny leaned forward. "Gerald, if you need legal support, I know a good attorney." A cousin's wife was shaking her head. Aunt Marlene looked like she might faint. Denise was still going, real tears now, mixed with the performance ones, impossible to tell apart. Gerald crossed his arms and waited. He expected me to deny, to cry, to beg, to storm out. That was the script. That was the version of me he'd sold to everyone in this room. I looked up at him. "Are you done?" I asked, my voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. I stood up slowly, no rush. I smoothed the napkin on the table beside my plate like I was finishing a meal at a restaurant. Every person in that room was watching. The football game was muted now. Even the kids at the folding table had gone silent. "I want everyone here to remember something," I said. My voice was steady. I wasn't performing. I was past that. "I didn't start this. Dad did." I turned to face Gerald directly. "So I'm going to ask you one question, Dad, in front of everyone, and I want a clear answer." Gerald's chin lifted, defiant, still in control, or so he believed. "Did Grandpa Earl write that will?" "Of course he did," he snapped. "You're sure?" His eyes narrowed. "Are you calling me a liar in front of my whole family?" I didn't answer that. I let the question hang in the air like smoke. Then I bent down and reached under my chair. My fingers found the bag. Inside it, the manila envelope, heavy, sealed, 4 months in the making. I placed it on the table right next to his fake summons. The room didn't move. Gerald stared at the envelope. It was thick. It was real. And for the first time all night, something shifted behind his eyes. A flicker fast, like a candle caught in a draft. I looked at him. "Funny," I said. "So do I." Nobody spoke. Gerald's smile was gone, not slowly. All at once, like someone had reached inside his face and pulled it off. I unsealed the envelope. Denise stopped crying, and 32 people leaned forward. I pulled the first page from the envelope and held it up. "This," I said, projecting my voice so the back of the room could hear, "is a side-by-side comparison of the signature on the will Dad filed in probate and 17 verified signatures from Grandpa Earl. Tax returns, bank documents, a vehicle title, all confirmed authentic." I passed the page to Aunt Marlene, who was closest. She put on her reading glasses. The left column showed the signature from Gerald's will. The right showed Earl's real handwriting. 17 samples, all consistent. The slanting E, the long-tailed P, the way his hand shook more in recent years but kept the same rhythm. The signature on Gerald's will was stiff, upright, careful. A copy made by someone trying too hard. Marlene's lips parted. She looked up at Gerald, then back at the page, then passed it to Uncle Danny without a word. "A forensic accountant examined these samples," I said. "Her professional conclusion is that the signature on the probate will is forged." "That's a lie." Gerald's voice came out louder than he intended. A few people flinched. "You paid someone to make that up." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. "I'm not asking anyone to believe me," I said calmly. "I'm asking you to look." The page moved down the table, person by person. I watched their faces change. Confusion, then recognition, then something harder. Uncle Danny held the page up to the light and shook his head slowly. Travis stared at it for a long time, then set it down and pushed it to the next person without looking at Gerald. Denise hadn't touched her napkin in 2 minutes. She was watching Gerald. Not with sorrow, but with fear. I reached into the envelope for the second document. I pulled out a single handwritten page, yellowed, creased, familiar in a way that made my throat tighten. "This is Grandpa Earl's real will," I said. "Written in his own hand, witnessed by 2 neighbors, dated 5 years before he died." I read the key line aloud. I leave all real and personal property to be divided equally among my 4 grandchildren, Oilia, Nolan, Travis, and Megan. Not Gerald, not his son, his grandchildren. Gerald took a step back, his chair hitting the wall behind him. Where did you get that? That isn't legitimate. And then Aunt Ruth stood up. She'd been sitting at the far end of the table, so quiet most people had forgotten she was there. She was 74, small, silver-haired, wearing a church dress she probably hadn't worn in years. The room turned to her. Earl gave it to me, Ruth said. Her voice was thin but clear. 3 years ago. Sat me down at my kitchen table, handed me this envelope and said, "Keep this safe, Ruth, because I don't trust my own son." Nobody breathed. Gerald stammered, "Ruth, you don't know what you're—" "I'm not finished," she interrupted, her eyes flashing. "Gerald went to your grandpa's house every week those last 3 years, told Earl that Oilia didn't want to see him anymore, told him she'd moved on, cut off the phone calls, returned the letters." She looked at me, her eyes softening. "Earl died thinking his granddaughter forgot him." I felt the room shift, not toward me, not toward Gerald, but toward something none of them had prepared for. The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was the sound of 32 people recalculating everything they'd been told. Gerald's face was white. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Denise whispered to no one, "Oh, God." I pulled the last page from the envelope. After probate closed, Dad withdrew $350,000 from Grandpa's accounts. I held the sheet so the room could see the columns. "This is where every dollar went." I read it slowly. No emotion, just numbers. 120,000, Dad's personal credit card debt. 85,000, an outstanding loan on his truck. 60,000, transferred into an account under Mom's name. 45,000, paid to a contractor for renovations on their house. 40,000, withdrawn in cash, destination unknown. I set the page down. That's $350,000 that belonged to 4 grandchildren, not 1 son. Gerald grabbed the back of his chair for support. "That's my father's money. He left it to me legally." "No, Dad," I said, keeping my voice level. "He left it to us, all 4 of us. You forged his will to take it." The room was so still I could hear the clock on Marlene's mantel ticking. Someone at the far end of the table, I think it was Danny's wife, set her glass down and pushed her chair back slowly, trying to leave without making a sound. Travis was staring at the tablecloth, jaw tight. Megan had her hand over her mouth. Aunt Marlene picked up her napkin, folded it once, placed it beside her plate, and pushed her chair out. She didn't stand. She just separated. Inches of distance that meant everything. Uncle Danny, the same man who 5 minutes ago offered Gerald a lawyer, turned in his seat. "Gerald," his voice was careful. "Is this true?" Gerald looked at him, then at Marlene, then at Denise, who had stopped crying entirely and was staring at the table like it might open up and swallow her. He didn't answer. His eyes swept the room, searching for someone, anyone still on his side. He found no one. "She's manipulating all of you." His voice cracked on the second word. These are fabricated. She paid people too." "Then explain the money, Dad," I said. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. $350,000. Where did it go? He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing. That's when Nolan stood up. Every head in the room turned. Nolan, 28, quiet, the one who never took sides, was standing at the middle of the table with his phone in his hand. "I heard them," he said. His voice was tight, like he was holding it together with both fists. 2 months ago in the kitchen. They didn't know I was in the garage." He looked at Gerald, then at Denise. "Dad said, she can't prove anything. The will is filed. It's done." "Nolan, don't," Gerald whispered, the color draining from his face. "And Mom said, but what if she gets a lawyer?" And Dad said, "Then we go louder, we make her the villain, nobody's going to believe her over us." Nolan tapped his phone screen and set it on the table. Gerald's voice filled the room, muffled, recorded through a garage wall, but every word clear enough to land. "She can't prove anything. The will is filed. It's done." Then Denise's voice, "But what if she gets a lawyer?" Then Gerald again. "Then we go louder, we make her the villain." The recording ended. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. Gerald sat down heavily, like the bones in his legs had quit. Denise said, barely above a whisper, "I told you this would happen." Not grief, not shame, anger directed at Gerald. She'd known. She warned him. And now the room knew she'd known, too. I want to be honest with you here. Standing in that room, watching my father's face collapse, watching the house of cards he built come tumbling down, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel the rush of glory that people talk about in movies. I felt hollow. I felt a profound sense of sadness because this wasn't a courtroom drama. This was Thanksgiving. These were people I had loved my entire life. But I learned something that day. Love doesn't mean letting someone dismantle you, and silence isn't peace. It's just permission. Permission for them to keep hurting you. Permission for the lie to grow. I didn't destroy my family that day. My father did that years ago when he decided his greed was worth more than his daughter's future, more than his father's dignity, more than the truth. I just turned the lights on. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to stand alone against people who were supposed to protect you, please hit that like button. It helps this story reach others who might need to hear it. And subscribe if you want more stories like this. I have plenty. I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think Nolan did the right thing by waiting 2 months, or should he have spoken up sooner? There is no right answer, but I want to know your take. Thank you for staying with me this long. I know it was a journey. If you want to know what happened next, the legal fallout, the trial, and whether Gerald faced prison time, check out the video linked on the screen right now. It's the sequel to this story, and it gets even more intense. Take care of yourselves and remember, boundaries aren't walls, they're doors, and you hold the keys.